Hi, I'm John Dubois, the designer of Avignon, and I'm answering the question for Mr. Petty's design class about the rules of games. Do they have to follow certain guidelines, or can they be however the designer wants them to be? What I have found, both designing and playing games, is that any way you can format your rules that is understandable to players reading the rules for the first time is good. Also, the rules have to be very easily referenced if a question comes up. And what that usually means for me, in terms of structure, is that the rules have to start with what you're trying to do in the game, who you are, and what are you trying to do. So if I'm designing a game, and I am, about an auto union on strike, I start with, okay, you're members of a union, and you're trying to get the company you work for to agree to certain concessions while you're on strike. And then I go into the mechanisms of the game and how you do that. So you have to place workers on stations to stop those stations from working. And then I kind of get into the nitty gritty of how a turn works. First, in your turn, you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And then I close out with what causes the game to end and who wins at the end of the game. And I've found that format of starting with how the players identify with the game's mechanisms, who they are and what are they doing, and then going into a turn sequence, and then finishing up with how the game ends, is a format that's easily followed. There are other things you have to talk about, like what components are in the game, and those often come at the start of the rules. But if you can address those as the rules go on in a way that flows and makes sense to the players, then that's something I've also seen done well. And so that's how I tend to organize my rules, just because that's what's easiest for players. Unfortunately, the simple answer to the question is you don't. Good is very subjective, and what is good for one group might not be good for another group. However, in terms of knowing whether something is good enough to continue with, I continue working on games as long as they keep being fun for me and my playtesters. And I know that a game is good enough to kind of move to the next step, either further development, contacting a publisher, or the like, if I'm able to get good positive reactions from multiple playtest groups with multiple different interests. For example, with Avignon, I took the game to a convention which was just a convention for playtests, and about 30 groups played it. And out of those 30 groups, only one really had a lot of negative things to say about the game. Everybody else seemed to like it, and that was when I knew it was time to move on because that game was good enough. The amount of time it takes to design and publish a game varies a lot based on the nature of the game, how much is in the game, and also how much revision the game requires. For example, my game Avignon, which has 18 cards in it, took about 5 months to design and probably another 6 to 7 months on top of that to publish, which is pretty fast. Games that are more complicated, even games considered to be gateway games like Pandemic, can sometimes take years to design and publish. I even have another game that's about the same size as Avignon, 18 cards, that I've been designing for 3 years and still have not been able to find a publisher for. And the publishing time can also vary based on things like what kind of components do you need, what level of artwork do you need, and things like that. So it's really difficult to give an average figure on things like that. Designing and publishing is not a process that you can kind of put a timeline on and have it follow that timeline. It's kind of as much as it needs. I don't know a lot from the publisher side, but as a game designer, I work another full-time job, and so game design is something of a hobby of mine that I happen to get paid for. and I know that most designers work on the same schedule. So my work hours are whenever I have time to work on things. I've learned to really treasure my daughter's naps. That's a great time to get a couple of solid hours in a game. Nights when my wife's putting my daughter to bed or when she's tired and I'm not, I'll get an hour or two in there. But it's a lot of get an hour in here, get an hour in there, meet with people for an afternoon to play test things. It's not a set schedule that you can rely upon unless you really go out of your way and have a lot of flex time to be able to do that. It's a lot of do what you can when you can. I have only made one game so far, but based on the amount of money I'm getting paid for that game, and what I've heard from friends in game design about how much they get paid for their games, I don't know that there's a point at which I would be making what I consider to be decent money. Game design is definitely a labor of love, and the way the market works, the royalties you get from game design aren't that great for making a decent wage. I'm happy to get paid for doing something I love, but it's certainly not something that I would do for the money. That just isn't where things are, isn't where the money is. There's a saying for publishers, which is the best way to make a small fortune in games is to start with a large fortune. It just is not a way to make a good profit. So my design philosophy is that less is more. The more that you can do with a smaller number of components as cards is always better. And the more complex decisions you can get players to try to make with a smaller amount of information or mechanisms is also always better. So for me, I know I'm trying to do too much for one game, always. I am always trying to do too much, and so I'm always trying to find ways to take things out of games, to make them smaller, to make them more accessible, to make player decisions easier to analyze, if not easier to make. And that is how I tend to reach that decision point, is just cut things from my game until I have nothing the game can't do without. From my perspective, I tend to stop changing games the moment that I submit them to publishers for consideration. If I am still making changes to a game, it is not yet ready to show a publisher, and I think that one of the easiest ways to cue a publisher that I haven't done the work that I need to do is to send them a game, and then when they come back to me, in 2 to 3 months with their opinions in the game, go, oh, I've got a whole different version of that game. Once I send it in, that is kind of when I lock down changes. And then I make more changes as the publisher needs them. And after that, I stop making changes when the game goes to print. Design really is a continuous process. And I stop making changes when it's not appropriate to make them anymore from a business or relationship or production standpoint.